We're back now to talk books. This weekend here in Washington, the Library of Congress celebrated its 15th National Book Festival. This one marking the 200th anniversary of the library's acquisition of Thomas Jefferson's personal collection. The event featured more than 170 authors, and one of the big draws, delighting fans of all ages, was Apollo 11 astronaut Buzz Aldrin, who left his footprints on the surface of the moon in 1969. Buzz Aldrin is here with us now to talk about the next step for the U.S. space program in the mission to Mars and his newly released children's book, Welcome to Mars. Also joining us is Pulitzer Prize winner David McCullough, who wrote The Wright Brothers, about Wilbur and Orville's historic first flight. Rachel Swaby joins us. She's the author of Headstrong, 52 Women Who Changed Science and the World. And Walter Isaacson is the author of The Innovators, How a Group of Hackers, Geniuses, and Geeks Created the Digital Revolution. Buzz, I want to start with you. You have a children's book.
I do.
Why?
I've had a couple before, but this one, the other writer would understand. This is so fantastic an explanation at the level of comprehension of middle schools. I learned something that Marianne taught me. She followed the vision of mine very, very closely. And I can build off of this very nicely.
David McCullough, I want to ask you, in The Wright Brothers, you said it's a truly American story. What is it about this that is so, about the Wright Brothers, that's so American?
Well, the fact that they seem to come into the world with few advantages. They grew up in a house that had no running water, no indoor plumbing, no electricity, no telephone. And Orville, the younger brother, years later was asked if he agreed that this was an example of how far someone with no advantages can go in an American life. And he said, well, that's not true. He said, we grew up with the most important advantage anybody can have. We grew up in a home where intellectual curiosity was encouraged and stimulated. And the fact that they never went to college seems also a burden for them. But the truth was that they also grew up in a house that was full of books, and their father and mother stressed that reading and learning to use the English language were essential to a full life and to have purpose in your life. I think that, and the purpose of the country in those times, that era, between, let's say, the late 19th century and 1910, or up to the time of the First World War, was progress on all levels. And that's different from today. Today is more protection. And that's, you have to understand the time in which people live as well as where they came from.
Rachel Swaby, you said that your book started with beef stroganoff. Why?
So you may remember, but in 2013 there was an obituary for Yvonne Brill in the New York Times. And it started off, she made a mean beef stroganoff, followed her husband from town to town, and was world's best mom. It wasn't until the second paragraph that it mentioned, oh yeah, she was the only woman, American woman working in rocket science in the 1940s, and also she designed a propulsion system that keeps satellites in orbit. So after that I thought, you know, we need better profiles of women in science. We really need to promote their work in science. So I wrote a book.
Some of the characters are also in Walter's book. Walter, in your book, you make a case for innovation that is collaborative.
Absolutely.
And so tell us a little bit about that argument that you make.
Well, you know, we biographers have a dirty little secret. We try to make it seem like there's some lone inventor who goes to a garage or a garret and has a light bulb moment. If you read David's magisterial book, you have a team that's sort of a brilliant guy, Wilbur Wright, a great engineer, Orville Wright, but then a whole team they put together to make engines. Same way the computer was made, same way the internet was made. And so to me, the women who got written out of the story, like Grace Hopper, who's in your book, like Ada Lovelace, who begins and ends my book, they were all part of teams in which creativity becomes a collaborative effort.
Buzz, you were a part of a big team that got you to the moon. Tell us a little bit about that sense of teamwork that led to that.
The critical decision that really made Apollo work was the decision by an engineer from Langley to do a rendezvous around the moon to save weight, expense, and to make this work much more better than well-known people who wanted to rendezvous around the Earth. That person was John Houbolt. It took him 3.5 years to get the message across. It's taken me since 1985 working on now there's another person, Professor Richard Batten at MIT. And he and an engineer worked on a spacecraft that was going to go to Mars, take one picture, circle around, and land in the Gulf of Mexico. No contact with the Earth at all. Navigating only, self-contained, autonomous navigating by measuring the angle between a star and the lit horizon, either on the top or the bottom, over and over again. That navigation system inspired many of us at MIT, but it was used in this proposal to send this spacecraft to Mars and back with one picture. That is, without a doubt, why MIT, together with other institutions and manufacturers, won the guidance and navigation contract for the Apollo mission.
Walter, I want to ask you about where these ideas come from. Ada Lovelace writes about the combining faculty, and you start the book with this idea. I mean, she is the son of a great daughter, excuse me, of a great poet.
Yeah,
right?
Lord Byron, and she connects poetry and processors. She connects arts and sciences. And that's what we did when we created the space program. That's what, you know, Wilbur and Orville Wright, they were people of pure curiosity. And this connecting faculty to say, it's the arts and the sciences when they come together. It's what Steve Jobs was driven by. He always ended his presentations with that street sign of the arts and the sciences and said that's where innovation lies. And it also comes from a time when we all used to aim high. That's what it means, going to the moon, going to the Mars, going to do flight, inventing the internet. I think as a country, we don't aim high anymore. We're a little bit too protected.
David,
Big ideas.
Yeah.
Here, John Kennedy says we'll go to the moon. And look
I just told him at the 100th anniversary of MIT,
person on moon.
They said that President Kennedy went to NASA and said, I think we should go to Mars. They were aghast. They spent one busy weekend putting charts together and then told the president, no, Mars out of the question. Maybe we'll get to the moon 15 days,
But David,
15 years.
In the case of the Wright brothers, Buzz talked about the resistance to the idea of going to Mars. People said you couldn't fly either.
you couldn't fly, and furthermore, once they did fly, it took 5 years for them to convince people that come and see what we've done. Not the local newspapers, not the government here in Washington would even bother to come and watch. And one of the editors of the Dayton paper, where they were flying right 8 miles outside of Dayton at Huffman Prairie, still there, was later asked, why in the world didn't you realize this was happening right under your noses? He said, well, I guess we were plain stupid.
Rachel, all the characters in your book have big hurdles against them because they've constantly got men saying, well, women don't do this. What's your favorite story of a character who got around and the lengths they took to get around?
Right, so a lot of favorites, but one, Rita Levi-Montalcini, who is a Nobel Prize winning scientist. She was Italian and she was practicing when Hitler was in power, and so she was told she wasn't able to work anymore. And so that was a bummer. So she decided to create her own bedroom lab. It was a secret lab. Her brother made an incubator. She got fertilized eggs from down the street. She filed down a knitting needle and started doing her experiments with her little scalpel. And she was able to do really important work from her bedroom, and she published papers that were then seen by scientists in the US. And she went for a research trip for a couple of months and ended up being there for decades.
My favorite is the trip she took with the 2 mice in her
Yeah.
pocket. All right, we'll be back in a moment with more from our book panel. Stay with us. And we're back with more from our authors panel. Walter, I want to start with you we were talking about perseverance in the face of opposition. What about risk-taking in the entrepreneurs that you write about?
Risk-taking is the key thing that separates America from the rest of the world. We allow people to fail, and whether it's Orville Wright when the plane crashes and he breaks legs and everything else, there's a consequence to it, but you still get back up and people still invest in you. Steve Jobs, the movie of Steve Jobs that's coming out that Aaron Sorkin did, it's all about that period when he was in the wilderness and failed and then had to deal with his personal relationships and everything else, and he comes back as a better person. And I think that whether it's Silicon Valley or everything we've done up until recently, we allow people to take risks, and when they fail, we say, okay, fine, we'll invest in you again because you've learned something. But here in Washington, I think that's a big problem now, because I think people are too risk-averse because it's easier to just be safe.
Yeah, you're never allowed to admit a mistake. Rachel, Alice Hamilton took a few risks when she was doing her own experiment. I love the story about the cocaine that she was. Tell us that story.
Right, so there was a problem at the turn of the century where drugstore workers were peddling cocaine to kids coming home from school. And so it became a bigger problem when the kids wanted more and they couldn't afford it. And so social reformers jumped in. And when it went to court, she came in as somebody who was supposed to tell the difference between cocaine and some other powder. But there were a number of problems, and so she first tried testing the cocaine on Bunny's eyes, but the jury wasn't really into it because cocaine will dilate the eye and the other powder wouldn't. So she decided to do it on herself.
Did it on her own eyes.
On her own eyes, and it was very effective.
David, they say the difference between a risk and a gamble is that you can back out of a risk, that with a gamble, there's no going back. Where were the Wright brothers? They took risks, of course, but they also seemed to be quite calculated in the risks they took. Is that right?
Yes, they were not daredevils. They looked into every conceivable possibility that could go wrong, which was mainly to make sure that their machine, whatever it was in the right order before taking off. But most people, if you ask them who were the Wright brothers, they'll say, well, they invented the airplane, and they were bicycle mechanics, and they came from Ohio. And that's about all most of us know. It's all really essentially what I knew. Yes, they did invent the airplane, but equally important, they invented how to fly the airplane, and that was where the risk came in. Now, to even attempt to become pilots and have it was running the risk of being thought of as a crackpot, a weirdo. But every time they took off on a test flight, they knew they could be killed. And they consequently, and they went off, well, not 2 or 3 times, they'd go off 50 to 100 times in a year. They would never fly together because if one got killed, they wanted the other one still to be alive to carry on with the mission. So their courage, they had both intellectual courage and physical courage, which I think is something absolutely to be remembered because that's not easy. And particularly when you have a lot of people who are worrying every single day because they love you so much that you're going to get killed.
Right. Buzz, you know about risk. You've walked in space. You've walked on the moon. Tell us about the moment where you thought, this is the riskiest thing I'm doing.
I think the riskiest was being in combat in Korea, really. There is great uncertainty. We felt there was great certainty. The engineers said 95% or greater. We had no choice but to believe them. But we as a crew were concerned about the most important thing on Apollo 11 was landing. Yeah. And we said, what what's the chance of our being able to land and not have to come back and be safe about it? 60%. 6 out of 7 missions to the moon were successful. We are now very risk averse in this country. I believe that this nation is the nation that can begin to colonize. Now, when you colonize something, you go there, you look it over, and you come back. Not necessarily. If you can look over something from orbit, like the moon, like Mars, and build things there that are safe, then when you are ready, you can commit to permanence. We want to build up a population on Mars, and I think we can do that because we know what we can do from orbit, from the moon of Mars. Now, we can commit to permanence. We can change our mind as to what the mission plan is. That is guts. Yeah. That is what Americans have. And the crew members understand risk. They wouldn't have been test pilots. They wouldn't have gotten into combat.
All right, Buzz Aldrin, David McCullough, Walter Isaacson, Rachel Swaby, thank you all very much for being with us.
Thank you very much.
We'll be right back.